Hey friends, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Ayin Vav, Daf 76 of Masechta Yevamos. Friends, you can tell me what Daf Ayin Vav talks about. Daf 76. The first third talks about penises. The second third talks about, I guess, penises also, but indirectly. It talks about P'tsuah Dakas and Chros Shafchas. And then the third part just talks about Ammonis and Moabis. So, let's go weiter. So, we are on Daf Ayin Vav Mud Aleph, second line of the page. Amr Reviewed Amr Shmuel. Says reviewed in the name of Shmuel. Nika v'nistam. Alright, what if you got a hole in your penis? Like one that's not supposed to be there. And then it got clogged up. So, I guess it's technically not there anymore. Kol shilu nikre v'nikra. Pasul. Well, if it can I guess if via ejaculation it can tear it open again, it's pasul. V'ilav kosher, but if it won't tear it open again, okay, it's kosher. Because as long as it doesn't get torn open again, it's alright. I think the point is that we want to make sure that the semen is going to come out stark, and if it's coming out of, if it's leaking out of alternate holes, so it might not be so stark, and you might not be able to make a baby. Havi barovit. Right, the cats are getting excited. All right. Havi barovit. Rove asakasha eicha. Where is this hole? If we're talking about sort of at the end of the penis, afilu nichros nami. Well, even if it was entirely cut off, it would be okay. So forget about holes. Even if you're missing like the entire tip of the penis, it would still be okay. Elabatare atzma. I don't know. Rather talking about the atara itself. I don't know. Maybe like kind of the beginning of the top of the penis. Sure, let's go with that. Itmar nami. It was also stated. Amar Rav Mari bar Mar. Amar Mar Ukva Amar Shmuel Nikib ba'atara atzma v'nistam. That if there's a hole on the beginning of the top of the penis and it filled up, kol she'ilu nikra v'nikra apostle. If you can ejaculate and then the hole opens up, tears open again, well then it's a problem. V'ilav kosher. But if it won't tear open again, then it's okay. Shalach le'Rav b'rei d'Rav le'Rav Yosef l'amdeni Rabbeinu hechi avdinon. Well, how do we check it out? A guy comes to us, he says, look, I have a hole in my penis, and I'm not sure if it's like a problem or not. So what do we do? So Yosef says, this is what you do. You take warm barley bread, and you put it on his butthole, and then he'll ejaculate. Alright? And then we'll see. Alright. Well. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Hopefully, let's go weiter. Okay. Amar Abai says Abai Atu Kuli Ama Yankev Avinu Avoy. Says Abai, come on, this is a little weird. He says, wait, look, at the end of the day, is everybody Yaakov Avinu, it's only that it says about Yaakov Avinu that by Reuven, that Reuven was the first semen that ever left Yaakov's body was Reuven, was the semen that created Reuven, meaning Yaakov Avinu was on such a madrege that mamash he never saw Keri. Shalorah Keri miyomov, that he had never seen Keri until he till the seed that created Reuven. Right, so meaning the point is, do we really have to go to such great awkward lengths in order to figure out if this guy is a crow shafcha or something? So rather says rather you kind of bring in front of him colorful clothing, you get him aroused, and then he'll ejaculate, and then you look and you see did it tear open some kind of a hole in his penis that shouldn't be there? Okay. Rava says, Rava takes the opposite position, which is, what is everybody Barzilai Agiladi, who's a shtickle promiscuous, and just that we don't have to try to, and then we could just ejaculate whenever we want. So, rather, it makes more sense, the whole warm bread on the butthole thing. Nikav Pasul Mipnei Shu Shoses. The reason why a hole in your penis that shouldn't be there is a problem is because then the semen is just going to drip out. Nistam Kash Mipnei Shu Molik. But if it gets plugged up, well then you're back in business because you can make babies again. Vizeo Psul Shechosel Echshero. This is an example of something that is possible but becomes kosher again. If you get an unwanted hole in your penis, so then that's a problem. But if it gets filled up again, so then it becomes kosher again. When it says this is to the exclusion of what? The mute krum she Allah machmas make bereya, to the exclusion of some kind of scar tissue that forms on some kind of injury that you had in your lung. The anal krum, it's not considered tissue. Okay, and that I guess would remain a problem. Okay, Shalach le Ravidi bar Avin Abaye. Ravidi bar Avin sends to Abaye, Hechi Avdinon. How do we fix this? If you have an unwanted hole in your penis, what do you do about it? This is interesting. It's like a shtickle surgery over here. Hafoichba v'hafoichba dekulaba. You learn how to do shtickle surgery. Hechi Avdinon. So what do you do? Maisinan sarta. So you take a barley kernel, and you scratch the hole with the barley kernel, I guess, to open it up a little bit. Maisinan tarba. Then you take like some kind of fat, and you rub the fat. You apply the fat to the hole. Maisinan sumsina gamla. And then you take an ant. Umenachtinon lei. And the ant bites the fat that's in the hole. Ufaskinan leideration. Then you sever the head of the ant from its body, and you leave the head in there to sort of plug it up, and then eventually it'll just kind of like heal, and the ant head will fall out, and then you're back in business. Dafka sarta. Now specifically scratch the hole with a barley kernel of a parzla, but if you use iron, I guess. Mizar, kilo metal, mizar, if it's going to scratch there and it's going to scar. Is that what it said? I think it was going to scar or something. And they were talking about small holes in the penis, but big ones, this procedure will be ineffective. A fellow who urinates from two different holes. Okay, apostle, I guess he'll be considered like a crow shafcha or something. Rava says that the halacha is not like the son and it's not like the father, right? Rav bar Ravuna was the son of Ravuna. Says Rava, the halacha is neither like Rav bar Ravuna nor is it like his father. So the son was that which Rav bar Ravuna just said, that somebody who pees from two places. So is possible. We don't pass it like that. All right. Abba. The Rafuna, when we say that Allah is not like the father either, it's not like Rafuna, it's referring to that two women who have sexual intercourse with one another, so then they're not allowed to marry Kohens, according to Rafuna. So Rav is saying that the Allah is not like Rafuna, and that even according to Rabbi Lazar, even according to Rabbi Lazar, who says that an unmarried boy who sleeps with an unmarried girl makes her a zona, that's specifically a boy and a girl. But two women, that would just be something that would be considered inappropriate, but would not necessarily make her apostle to marry a kohen. It says the Mishnah P'tzuadaka Shafcha Mutar B'Gyoros M'Shuchreres. So a P'tzuadaka, a fellow with crushed testicles, a fellow whose penis is cut off. Alright. Mutarim B'Gioris, they're allowed to marry a convert, Mishucheres, or a emancipated Canaanite maidservant. They're just not allowed to marry into the congregation, I guess, the rest of the Jewish community. Shnemar, as the Pasuk says, as the Pasuk says, that a P'tuadaka friend and a Kroshavcha friend cannot marry into the congregation of God. Bo mine mir Sheshes asked if Sheshes P'tuadaka koyin mal b'gyoros mishucheres. So a P'tuadaka, but he's a Kohen, can he marry a Gyoros and Mishucheres? So a Kohen in general cannot marry a convert or a emancipated. I think emancipated means like freed, right? Kind of a freed Canaanite maidservant. Now, what are we saying? Right, a Kohen in general cannot marry a Gyoros and Mishucheres. What we want to know is, what if the Kohen is a P'tuadaka or a Choshavcha? In that case, can he marry a Gyoros? Wait, what? What? If the right, exactly. I just lost my train of thought. But basically, a Kohen is not allowed to marry a Gyoros and Mishucheres. But if he is a P'tuadaka, would he be allowed to marry a Gyoros or a Mishucheres? Do we say that even though he's a P'tuadaka or a Choshavcha, he still remains with the holiness of his Kehuna, with the halachos of Kehuna, the Asir, and therefore he would not be allowed to marry a Gyoros or Mishucheres? Or perhaps, since he's a P'tuadaka or a Choshavcha, so then he doesn't retain the same halachis, the same stringencies of when he was a Kohen, and therefore he would be allowed to marry a Gyoros and Mishucheres. Amalei Rav Sheshes Tnisur. Rav Sheshes says, well, we have a brayso that says P'tuadaka Yisrael muter b'nesino. That a P'tuadaka Yisrael is allowed to marry a nesino. Nesino were from the 7 nations, and they kind of tricked Yoshua into being spared when the Yidden got into Eretz Yisrael. So in general, the Yidden are not allowed to marry Nosins. However, we're saying that a P'tuadaka Yisrael is allowed to marry a nesino. Now, v'sakadaitech b'kedushasei koi, and if it enters your mind to say that a P'tuadaka retains the kedusha, well, then I would assume that you're not allowed to marry, right? It says about the 7 nations, you're not allowed to marry them. So how come a P'tuadaka is allowed to marry a nesina? It must be that P'tuadakas don't have kedusha, and therefore the Kohen doesn't have the same kedusha, and therefore this Kohen who's a P'tuadaka or a Choshavcha would be allowed to marry a Gyoros or a Mishucheres. So Rava says, Rava, wait a second. Mishum kedusha v'lav kedusha is the reason why a Yid is not allowed to marry a Nesina. Is it because of kedusha? Is that why? That we're concerned that it's a matter of holiness, a matter of kedusha? No, rather, when it comes to the 7 nations, the reason why you're not allowed to marry the 7 nations is Dilomolid Ben V'azu Palach Lavodos Kochavim. We're concerned that if you marry into the 7 nations, well then your offspring may end up being an idol worshipper. That's why you're not allowed to marry into the 7 nations. However, that only applies if they haven't converted to Judaism. Now, Kimagaire, but if they convert to Judaism, like the Givonim, these Givonim converted to Judaism, in the context of getting this protection from Yoshua. So therefore, Mishra Sharu. So therefore, technically speaking, if somebody from the 7 nations converts to Judaism, so then technically you would be able to marry them. But the rabbis nonetheless said that. The rabbi said that we don't want you marrying Givonim, the Givonim and the Sinim, even though they converted to Judaism. Now, when the rabbis say that you're not allowed to marry a Nasin, it's specifically a Nasina, it's specifically people who are able to have children. But these, P'tuadaka, Choshavcha is not capable of having children, so therefore the rabbi said, okay, you can marry Nesinas. So says Rav, meaning, so what happened? We wanted to know if you have a kohen, right? They asked of Sheshis, if you have a kohen who's a P'tzudaka, can you marry a Gioris or Meshucheres? He wanted to say, yes, he can. Because after all, a P'tzudaka is allowed to marry Nesina. It must be that they don't have the, that P'tzudaka, Choshofcha, does not have Kedusha, and therefore they can marry Nesina, and therefore this P'tzudaka who's a kohen would be allowed to marry a Gioris or Meshucheres. Fine. Rava says, however, the thing with, the reason why a P'tzudaka is allowed to marry a Nesina has nothing to do with, a Kedusha thing. It's not because a P'tzudaka doesn't have Kedusha. No, it's a different story. It's because we're concerned that, the only reason why you're not allowed to marry into the 7 nations is because we're concerned that then your children might serve idols and stuff, but if they convert to Judaism, then you can marry into the 7 nations. However, the rabbi said we don't want you marrying Nesinas. However, their gezerah is only by people who are able to have children, but that wouldn't apply to a Kros Shafcha or a P'tzudaka, and therefore the reason why a P'tzudaka or Kros Shafcha is allowed to marry Nesina has nothing to do with Kedusha. It has to do with the gezerah d'Rabbanan, and that the gezerah d'Rabbanan doesn't apply to P'tzudaka and Kros Shafcha since they can't have children. But then, frekti Gemara, Elimata Mamzer de Ba'olude Hachinami de Asir. Well, then the Gemara says, if it's just that the rabbis didn't make their gezerah in a situation where they're unable to have children, well then, what about a mamzer? Based on that logic, a mamzer who is able to have children should be unable to marry a nesina. We learn in the Mishnah, mamzerim nesinim mutarim lavu zevaze, that a mamzer and a nesina are allowed to get married, even though they're able to have children. So the Gemara says, okay, fine. When the rabbis said that you're not allowed to marry Nesinas, that is for kosher people. Kosher people are not allowed to marry Nesina, but pasul people like mamzers, like P'tzudaka, Choshofcha, they would be allowed to marry Nesina. But still, it has nothing to do with Kedusha, it has to do with a Gzera d'Rabbanan. So, so therefore it's not a proof regarding the Kohen that he doesn't have this Kedusha. Hadar Amarava, but then Rava retracted and he says, Lab Milsi da Amri, what I said is incorrect. Biosan of the Kochom leislu chasanus. Nizgairu chasanus. Whereas Rava says, sorry, the whole premise of what I said before, which is that when the pasuk says Lo sischatein bam, do not marry the 7 nations, it's referring to if they haven't yet converted to Judaism. But if they have converted to Judaism, so then you can marry into them. Says Rava, that's obviously incorrect, because if they haven't yet married into Judaism, then if they haven't yet converted to Judaism, if they're just the 7 nations, obviously lo tischatein bam, meaning, well, not obviously, marriage wouldn't apply if they're not Jewish, right? Marriage would not apply. So obviously, if we're saying lo tischatein bam, do not marry into them, it's talking about even after they convert to Judaism, still don't marry into them. And it's a kedusha thing, right? It's that, and it's sort of a level of holiness thing. And from the fact that we say that a P'tzudaka and Kros Shafcha are permitted to marry in a sino, so then Memela means that they don't have kedusha, and if they don't have kedusha, so then a kohen who's a P'tzudaka would be able to marry a Gioris and Meshucheres, like Rav Sheshes says. All right. Where am I? Most of Rav Yosef. Now Rav Yosef asks you a kasha. Rav Yosef asks a kasha. V'ischatin Shlomo is Bas Paro Melech Mitzrayim. The pasuk says that Shlomo married Bas Paro, so she was not Jewish, and it says V'ischatin, that they got married. So there is marriage even by non-Jews. So Gayure Gaira. No, she converted. V'alo Kiblu Gerim Log Medav Log Me Shlomo. I thought that they didn't accept converts during the days of David and King David and King Solomon. Yeah, but says the Gemara, there's a reason for that. There's a reason why they didn't accept converts during the reign of King David and King Solomon. That's because we didn't want people converted to Judaism just because of the prestige of the kingship. But she's the daughter of Paro. She obviously didn't need that prestige. She already has a prestige. So therefore, converting was okay in this case. But even so, even if she did convert, But still, I mean, she's a first level, right? She's a first generation mitzvahist, right? And we know that Egyptians, you have to wait 3 generations. And if you're going to say, yeah, but those Egyptians that you're not allowed to marry, they all drowned in the sea, right? And the Egyptians, like, and the modern day Egyptians are a different breed of Egyptians, or a different, line of Egyptians, and you would be able to marry them. But that can't be, because we learned in the Brayso, Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda, Minyamin ger Mitzri, that Minyamin, the Egyptian convert, was a colleague of mine from the students of Rabbi Akiva. Omar, and he said, Ani Mitzri Rishon, I am a first generation Egyptian convert, so I married another first generation Egyptian convert, and what I'll do is I will marry my son off to a second generation Egyptian convert, so that my grandson will be able to marry into the congregation. So we see that even during the times of Rabbi Akiva, we were still taking seriously this halacha of not marrying an Egyptian convert for 3 generations. So therefore, how could it be that Shlomo married an Egyptian convert? So Amar Papa says, Papa on Shlomo Leiku v'Nasiv. Well, we asking kashas from Shlomo Melech. Shlomo lo Nasiv midi. Shlomo didn't actually marry her. Dichsiv Bey, as it says about Shlomo, Min hagoyim asher Amar Hashem al bnei Yisrael lo savau b'hem v'im lo yvoyu b'achem. That regarding those nations that God says that you should not marry into them, and they should not marry into you. Because they will, get your hearts to go against their gods. And Shlomo, nonetheless, connected with them to love them, and therefore it wasn't about marriage; it was about love. Right? Shlomo loved the daughter of Bas Paro; he desired her, but he didn't necessarily marry her. It doesn't say that he married her by Yischatein. No, but he didn't actually marry her, but because he loved her so much, it was as if he married her. Okay, so he didn't actually, the Maisa, marry Bas Paro. Ravashi says, but didn't we say, how could we say earlier that a P'tzua Daka is allowed to marry a Nesina? Didn't we say in our Mishnah that a P'tzua Daka and a Choshavcha are permitted by a convert, by an emancipated Canaanite maidservant, but not, that would exclude a Nesina? Amalei, to which Ravashi responds, according to you, what does the rest of the Mishnah say? That they're only forbidden from marrying into the congregation, implying, but what about Nesina? Would be permitted. Rather, you cannot learn out anything from here in terms of if a P'tzua, right? You can't bring a proof from our Mishnah whether or not a P'tzua Daka would be able to marry a Nesina. Alright. And now we get to a new Mishnah. Amoni Moavi Asurim Visur Nisar Olam. So an Ammonite and a Moabite, so they're not allowed to marry into the congregation forever. Okay, Visur Nisar Olam, it's forever. Havan Kivusein Mutaros Miyad. But their daughters, right? Female Ammonites and female Moabites can marry into the congregation, there's no delay. Mitzi Vadomi Ena Masurim Ela Ad Shlosha Doros. An Egyptian and an Edomite, so they're not allowed to marry into the congregation for 3 generations. And that applies both to boys and to girls, Yingles and Midals. Reb Shimon Matir and Akevis Miyad. Reb Shimon says no, that the Edomite and Egyptian Midals, the girls, can marry into the congregation immediately after they convert. Reb Shimon Kavachomer Hadvarim. Reb Shimon says, look, it's logical. If by Ammonis and Moavis, where the boys are never allowed to marry into the congregation, and yet the girls can marry immediately into the congregation, so then so when it comes to Egyptians and Edomites, that even the boys it's only a 3-generation thing. After that, they can marry into the congregation, since certainly the girls will be immediately able to marry into the congregation. Amrlo, they said to Reb Shimon, so they said to Reb Shimon, look, if that's a tradition that you have, that the Egyptian and Edomite girls can marry into the congregation immediately, so then Beseder will accept it. But if it's just that Kavachomer that you brought, well, we can respond to it. Amar Loim, Reb Shimon says to them, Loki, that's not true. You would not successfully be able to respond to my Kavachomer. And nonetheless, Allah Anim Omer, but still, it's a tradition that I received, that the girls of the Egyptians and Edomites are allowed to marry into the congregation immediately. How do we know that Moabite and Ammonite girls are allowed to marry into the congregation immediately? Rabbi Yochanan says that the pasuk says, "V'chiru Shaul as David yotzi likras haplishti," that when Saul saw David go towards Goliath, Omar el Avner sa'aratzova, Saul said to Avner, his general, Ben mizeh anar Avner, who is this fellow? Who is this lad? Vayomer Avner, chenafshcha melech im yodaiti. And Avner says, ich weiß nicht. V'lo yodalei. 1 second. Saul didn't know David. But the pasuk says that Saul loved David quite a bit. And David would carry his vessels for him. Rather, Saul was asking who David's father was. Wait, but Saul didn't know who David's father was. That it says regarding Yishai, the father of David, that it was during the days of Saul that Yishai was very old. Says Rav, sometimes say it was Rabba, that this is a reference to Yishai, the father of David, who would, anywhere he would go, he was with like a whole crew, a whole bunch of people with him. So what Saul was asking from Avner was to check about David to see, right, that of course King David came from the lineage of Judah, and he comes from, so that was the question, right? It says by Yehuda and Tamar that they then gave birth to 2 Yingles, right? One was Peretz and one was Zerach. So Saul was asking Avner, does David come from Peretz or from Zerach? So, Imi Peretz Asi, so says Saul, look, if David comes from Peretz, so then Malka Have, so then he'll be king. He's king material. Shemelech Poretz Lasso is there, because after all, a king is able to be Poretz. He's able to break through private property in order to make a road. Nobody could stop him. So therefore, if David comes from Peretz, it's like a king who has the power to be Poretz. If David comes from Zerach, it will simply be a nobleman, but he won't necessarily be a king. My taima, Omar le Shalale. And how come, what about David made Saul think to ask, like we should really look into who he is? The apostle says, Vayalbe Shaul is David Madov Kimidaso, that Shaul gave to David his own armor, Saul's armor, right, his garments. Kimidaso, and it fit David. And yet it says about Saul, that Saul was significantly bigger than everybody else. And yet, when he put his armor on King David, it fit King David perfectly. And that was a shtickle miracle. So that is why Saul wanted to know, like, who is this fellow? So it says, Doiga Adomi, he steps in, he says, wait a second. Shaul, you're trying to figure out, is he king material or is he just nobleman material? Does he come from Paris, in which he's king material, or does he come from Zerach, in which he's nobleman material? But forget that. She'al all of him, Roy Lavo B'Kal Lim Lav. go figure out if he's even able to marry into the congregation bichlal. My time, how come? Because as we know, the pasuk says in Sefer Rus at the very end that David is a descendant of Rus. So therefore, it says Doiga Adomi. I don't understand. Ammonis and Moavis are not allowed to marry into the congregation bichlal, and David comes from Rus, Hamoavia, and therefore says, Doeg Adomi, I don't understand. You're asking if he's fit to be a king. You might not even be able to marry into the Yidden. So Amalei Avner says to Doeg Adomi, Tanina, but we have a Mishnah, I guess. Hamoni v'lo Amonis, Moavi v'lo Moavis. Right, that that specifically boy Moabites and boy Ammonites are not allowed to marry into the congregation, but girls are allowed. Elmiata mamzer v'lo mamzeres, to which Doeg Adomi retorts, but when it says mamzer in the pasuk, does that imply but not female mamzers? Mamzer ksiv mumzar, to which the pasuk said, to which the Gemara answers, yeah, but a mamzer stands like an acronym, mumzar, some foreign blemish, and therefore, that's regardless of if it's a boy mamzer or a girl mamzer. But mitzri v'lo mitzris. But 1 second, should we say that the mitzri prohibition applies only to boys but not to girls? Shani acha d'mufarish taima dekra, to which the Gemara says, yeah, but enachinami. That's a good question. But the reason by Ammon and Moab why it only applies to the boys and not to the girls is because the pasuk says that the reason why we're not allowed to marry into the Ammonites and the Moabites is because they didn't come forth with bread and with water. Now this is more an activity for boys, that boys would generally go forth with bread and water, and not necessarily the girls. And therefore, it's the boys who are never allowed to marry into the congregation, but the girls can. To which Doeg Adomi replies, that the boys should have gone to the boys, the girls should have gone to the girls, from the fact that the girls didn't participate. So then, Memele, they should also be unable to marry into the congregation. Ishtik and Avner and / Shaul, they didn't have a response. So Miyad v'Yom HaMelech Sha'al Ato ben Miza Elim, and then it says immediately, Shaul says to Avner, ask who this Elim is, this lad is. Hasam Korle Nar, Acha Korle Elim. So before he called him a Na'ar, now he calls him an Elim. Hachi Ka'amale, this is what Shaul was saying to Avner. Halach Nesama Mimcha, clearly this halacha is hidden from you. Say Ushal B'Veis HaMedrash, go and ask in the study hall. Shaul Amrulei, so Avner went to the study hall and he asked, what's the deal with the, with a Moabite? Can she marry into the congregation? Nafkaminas for if David can be the king or not, or if he can even marry Bichlal into the congregation. And they said to him, well, the pasuk says Ammoni, but not an Ammonis, Moavi, and not a Moavis. I.e., it only applies to the boys, not to the girls. Actually, Doeg Kolani Kushisa, Doeg then asked all of the questions that he had asked earlier, right? About, that maybe it applies to the girls as well. So Ishtiku, and they didn't have a good answer. So Doeg then wanted to announce about David HaMelech that he cannot marry into the congregation because he comes from Rusam Moaviyah. Miyad immediately V'Amosa ben Ish Ushmo Yisra Yisraeli, and it says Amosa was the son of Yisra Yisraeli Asher ba el Abigail bas Nachash, who was with Abigail bas Nachash. And it says Yisra Yishmaeli. It says Yisra Yishmaeli. So one pasuk says Yisra Yisraeli, the other pasuk says Yisra Yishmaeli. So it teaches that he chapterain a sword like an Ishmaelite. And he said, Yidoker b'cherev, that if anybody is going to not listen, if anybody is going to ignore this halacha, that the girls from Edom, from Ammon and Moab are permitted to marry into the congregation. Kach mukublani mibeis dino shel Shmuel aramati. This is right. So anybody who ignores this halacha, Yidoker b'cherev, is going to get stabbed with a sword. All right. Kach mukublani mibeis dino shel Shmuel aramati. This is the tradition that I have from the Bezdin of Shmuel, the judge. Ammoni v'lo Ammonis, Moavi v'lo Moavis, that it is the male Ammonites and the male Moabites, not the females. Umi mehemen, but can you be trusted in such a circumstance? Ha'amr Rav Abba Amr Rav, kol Talmud Chacham shmor halacha uva, that if you have somebody who comes up with like a brand new halacha, halacha that people haven't heard before, look, if he said this halacha before there was actually a practical case, so then we can listen to him. But if he just kind of comes out of thin air, so we can't listen. So meaning, right, we're saying over here that we had this Shiloh with David HaMelech, and all of a sudden they're saying Ammoni v'lo Ammonis, Moavis v'lo Moavis. Nobody had ever heard that before. So we're saying, look, we can't just trust it, because if we had already heard it before, so Beseder, it's a thing, and it was already, even before the question arose, we already knew that this was the halacha. But if all of a sudden we're saying, look, David HaMelech comes from Rusa Moavia, and you're not allowed to marry Moabites, and we're saying, yeah, but it only applies to the boys, not to the girls. But you can't just say that all of a sudden. Nobody's ever heard that before. So the Gemara answers, Shani Yachid Zivin Ovir Da Shmuel Uveis Dino Kaim. Because Shmuel, the judge, and his Bezdin are still around, and we can always ask them. But still, what do we do with Doeg Adomi's question? Right? He said at the end of the day, I don't understand. The Ammonite and Moabite women should be unfit to marry into the congregation because they should have brought water and bread to the female Bnei Yisrael. So that the pasuk says in Tehillim that all of the honor of the daughter of a king is inward, i.e. that the women were more sort of not as active or not as proactive. Therefore, they were kind of more at home and not necessarily going out to bring water and stuff to the people. Marav Amr, they say in Eretz Yisrael, V'teimer Rabbi Yitzchak, Omar Kra Vayomer Elav Ayisar Ishcha V'gomer. It said, right, that the angel said to Avraham Avinu, where is Sarah, your wife? And he says, oh, she is in the tent, i.e. she wasn't out and about meeting the guests. She was inside, and therefore we're saying it wasn't necessarily expected that the Ammonite and Moabite women would come towards the Bnei Yisrael, even if it's just the women, with food and water and stuff. Therefore, we don't hold it against them, and the Ammonite and Moabite women would be permitted to marry into the congregation. Friends, that was Daf Ayin Vav Masechet Yevamos. Hope you enjoyed. Peace out.